So Wild Robot is one of the most amazing movies I've ever seen. If you haven't watched it yet, go do so. It's great. If you already watched it and if you want to explore some of the philosophy and symbolism behind it, I'm going to explain some of its main themes. So, in the beginning, the robot imitates a crab while trying to escape from the waves of the ocean and climb into the island. This is important because it's not just a funny scene. Imitation is what makes us human. Babies imitate a lot, even more than what you would expect. Animals and even monkeys imitate, but not as much. So, for example, there's a famous experiment where researchers were solving a problem in front of a human baby and a baby monkey. The problem was solved badly, in a very inefficient manner, and then each baby was shown the problem and they attempted to solve it. Your inclination might be that the human baby figures out a better way to solve the problem, because humans are smarter. But that's not what happens. The human baby copied the wrong way to solve the problem, the longer way, while the monkey was more independent and solved it in a better way that wasn't demonstrated by the experimenter. The reason is that babies are programmed to imitate more than just typical learning, because in human beings there's also a huge element of culture. You inherit a huge amount of culturally specific knowledge, behaviors, and rituals that you need to develop as an adult, which have nothing to do with instincts. In reality, the baby is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's learning from the culture of its parents and the environment. The monkey's independence is a net negative in that context. So part of the symbolism of imitation is the connection to culture and tradition, of following something that is higher, that is valuable. And it's something that you receive from your parents, from your culture, or from your society. And you will see this play out in a movie as something that is passed on, which is beyond nature. Once the robot successfully climbs into the island and explores it, it starts to unpack some of its more basic structure of the story. It presents a universe without meaning, simply a machine. And there are two kinds of machine. There's biological machines and mechanical machines. Island is a collection of animals that follow their instincts. They're just trying to survive. At some point, they mention that there's no kindness in the world of nature. The fox steals the bird's egg and says, "I'm a fox. I do foxy things." Now, part of that symbolism is specific to foxes, but some of that is a broader framework for animal life. So the defense of the fox is simply that it's following its programming, which seems very reasonable. But we see throughout the movie that the fox is transformed, transfigured through love. The same parallel applies to the robot. The robot is also a machine, but instead of being shaped by nature or evolution, it was shaped by someone else. And the robot is simply following its own programming. So we have these two extremes, the instincts of animal nature and then pure disembodied mathematical reasoning that follows the programming of someone else. The egg eventually hatches and there's a scene about naming. Now Roz doesn't understand the importance of naming. It first tries to give it a name of pure numbers, similar to what she has. But you can't name people numbers. Now why is that? It's not very easy to argue, but everyone knows it instinctively. Numbers are associated with counting and computation, but the worth of a human life is beyond pure mathematics. Numbers leads to dehumanization and the utilitarian framing. It also has to do with identity. It's the identity of someone unique. Having a unique name that isn't just a number is connected to the notion of sacredness for human beings. It's connected to what you're named after. In the West, traditionally, you're named after saints or people in the Bible, or even very old pre-Christian names that often have a sacred meaning, like a specific virtue. So for example, some people are called Grace. My grandmother is called Rose, which is a symbol of beauty. Even outside the West, the names typically have some kind of spiritual meaning. It also matters that it anchors you in the world, within the context of a tradition. A number is purely disembodied. It doesn't reference anything at all. It doesn't have context. It's something that it's dead. There's also a more metaphysical element. We have this tradition where naming creates reality itself. The act of naming something is portrayed as allowing it to participate more fully in existence. By identifying and naming, we bring phenomena from the chaotic background into the world of attention and care. It also has to do with a form of intelligence. because to identify something, you need to recognize its essence. It highlights this dimension of meaning and reality because consciousness categorizes things based on essences, which are then based on meaning. It points to a world beyond mechanical causes. So a lot of the narrative in this movie is about this mechanical worldview of the world, which to some degree is an eternal theme, and it pops even in our oldest mythology. But at least now in modernity, it's very easy to talk about these things because we live in such a mechanical world. So things like computers and robots allow us to make very close analogies that click right away, where the most ancient civilizations had to talk about it in a more abstract form. What I thought was so genius about the movie is that it constantly makes fun of this worldview of the world as simply a machine. In its most technical sense of psychology and psychiatry, it's a very autistic way of looking at the world. For example, when Roz tries to come up with a creative name that isn't just a number, it simply says a number that is out of sequence, which isn't what it was meant to do. But that's the typical response from that type of thinking. Another example is missing context, like criticizing that a bedtime story was problematic since sound can't travel in the vacuum of space. That was the critique from the robot, but it's not relevant. Another example that's really funny is Ross commenting on the physicality of the heart when the elder bird says that Bright Bill has a big heart. Obviously, saying someone has a big heart references something real, but the heart is an analogy. It's symbolic of something else that isn't a literal medical organ. So part of the movie's progression is moving from a mechanistic worldview to a fully embodied, meaningful and symbolic perception of reality. At some points, Roz says that she's listening with a different part of her, the heart, which we understand, but from a purely scientific perspective, it's a meaningless statement. And has a last example, when all the animals come together. The natural thought is how impossible that is because animals need to eat. But that's part of the larger narrative that mocks our missing of what's relevant. We're not seeing the story correctly. We're adopting a perspective that's not adequate. The point is communion and living in harmony despite an aggressive or conflicting nature. Even though the story is represented through animals, we don't need to view it too literally. Part of the commentary is a mockery of our own modern intuitions, that we're like the robots commenting that sound doesn't travel in space. The big contrast of this mechanistic world is love. A helpful metaphor is that love brings life from death. This can be interpreted as it allows a kind of resurrection, or that the world is dead until love shines through. That love is what brings light into the universe and finally brings about life in the deepest sense of not being mechanisms, either programmed or natural instincts. The robot is initially presented as another machine, but as the movie progresses, it's no longer the case. There's some symbolism about the soul. The animals don't have a soul because they're puppets of nature, and the robot doesn't have a soul because it's just a machine. But throughout the narrative, both the animals and the robots transcend their limitations imposed by the programming or nature, and they do that through love and communion. And this love is deeply connected with sacrifice. It brings love into existence. In the beginning, the robot was trying to help the animals in a programmed way, just to fulfill her task. But that wasn't love. It wasn't genuine niceness because it was just following the rules of its programming. It's equivalent to a superego. You're acting nice just because you're being told to, but it's not true in the deepest sense. It was only through responsibility and the willingness to take care of the egg and develop life and keep caring for it that true love came about. It brought about real care, not just a program. The robot eventually sacrifices for all the animals as well, and through it, the animals can also experience love and communion, and thus be transformed the same way that Roz was transformed with her relationship with Brightbill. The full expression of love is when there's self-sacrifice. The reason for that is that if love is important, how important is it? One way to answer the question is to consider what it overrides, what it has power over. Does it overpower money? Does it overpower comfort, happiness? Life is the most precious thing to give because everything else depends on it. Money doesn't mean anything if you're dead, and same with everything else. So self-sacrifice shows that love is the highest value of all. It is the ultimate value. And it is through this ultimate value that we see the transformation of the characters from a world of mechanical causes, instincts, and programming into a world that is sacred with meaning and love. There's a huge element of communion. So after the storm, there's absolute chaos when all the animals get together, which is a symbol or analogy for human beings. The whole island symbolizes the world, all of humanity. We're all slightly different, with different values, different looks, cultures, preferences, etc. But we're still part of the same island, the same world. We're in the exact same situation as the movie. One of the animals even says, if you can't keep it all together, then everyone is dead. And it's the same thing in the real world, even more so with modern technology, where we have forms of war that can literally obliterate the planet. We have a natural disposition towards conflict, and difference fuels that conflict. If you want to live together, we need to come together. But how can we do that? The animals were physically together in the island for a long time, but they weren't united. What ends up uniting them is the one who self-sacrifices for everyone else, even though everyone hated that individual in the beginning. No one liked the robot, but through the robot's love and eventual self-sacrifice, that becomes the unifying principle of all difference and conflict. So Roz says, sometimes to survive, we must become more than what we are programmed to be. It's this idea of transformation and striving towards something more than you are. And this is the entire calling of the religious life, to become more than what you are, to be transformed. Within this transformation from one world to another, the analogy of realness is also very helpful. The transformation isn't just a neutral state of change, in the same way that I might say that before I liked blue, but now I like reds. But it doesn't really matter very much, and it's subjective. But in this case, it does matter, and it's not subjective. The state of love is perceived as more real, or in another analogy, from being dead to being alive. And you see this kind of narrative everywhere. In the book that I wrote and that I'm about to publish soon, the exact same theme is played out in Blade Runner. The robot, which is K, begins as an emotionless replicant, but throughout his journey he becomes real. And this is culminated in his ultimate act of self-sacrifice, choosing to help Deckard reunite with his daughter at the cost of his own life. He was a being purely pulled by his drivers, by his programming. But he ended up being real, or becoming alive. And what is interesting is that what allows K to become real is that he started to believe that he was real, even when he wasn't. It's a kind of mistake or deception, but through that belief, that story, he acts differently, and thus he becomes real. But K isn't special, he was just another robot, in the same way that Roz wasn't special. It was the story that prompted the transformation. So if you have something to emulate and aspire to copy it, like Roz was copying the crab, then that opens the door to being reborn. Pinocchio has a very similar narrative as well, of becoming a real boy, even though he started just as a puppet. And the puppet is the most helpful analogy we have to describe this worldview before electronics and computers were widespread, but it's the exact same thing. So Roz eventually finds another robot that was also lost in the sea, and he makes all this really explicit, which recaps the transformation very nicely. You have this robot which is transformed into a new kind of being, and then you see what an actual robot is by default. It doesn't feel anything, it only has the purpose it was programmed for, and they can barely understand each other because they are so different. Roz has this beautiful analogy where she explains that the process that used to come from the brain now comes from the heart, and that's what's needed to solve problems, at least the problems that matter the most. And this is unintelligible to the other robot. It's almost insane. So the robot says, "You're defective." In the same way that with a typical materialistic framework, if you make claims about meaning and value, someone might say it makes no sense scientifically. They might reasonably be called insane, mentally ill. People typically don't literally do this because they have implicit values and worldviews they can't fully explain, but it would be very reasonable to do so. It would be coherent within that framework. The robot even says that you're not supposed to feel anything at all. That is the truly real. Being in that state of feeling is defective. There's also this interesting aspect of overriding her programming, which once again has to do with transformation. The one doing the transformation is you. That's the basic premise of the religious journey. You are on the path towards transformation in a way that better aligns you with what is ultimate and sacred. You're overriding your own programming from biology, from society, and you're evolving as a person in the process. You're overriding thinking with the brain towards thinking with the heart. But something that the movie nailed down quite well is that the thinking with the brain isn't completely useless. It's true that this mathematical and mechanical way of being is what causes problems throughout the movie. The robot can't easily get out of it at first. But the problem isn't necessarily that she has a brain, but more so that she doesn't have a heart. Even though this mathematical and scientific way of being is problematic, it's not worthless. For example, it helped teach Bright Bill to fly. It did so by analyzing aerodynamics and by building obstacle courses and so on. They're all based on science. We are embodied beings in a world that does have mechanical causes. So it's not completely unreal in the deepest sense. It's just an analogy to help you understand. The mechanical worldview isn't negative per se, as long as it doesn't obscure reality in its fullness, which includes human experience and meaning, and as long as it's used for a higher good, in this case for love, to help Bright Bill or to help the other animals. Roz is eventually captured and told she would lose her memories. This is a representation of death. You lose your identity if you don't have any memories. And she asks to keep at least one memory, the thing that matters the most, what is the most real, which is her memory of Bright Bill. But she's not allowed, and everything is erased. However, once Bright Bill is there, she does remember. So it's almost as if she is brought back to life. And this happens because of love. In some sense, it's as if love is more real than the physical substrate of her existence. In a traditional sense, as if it cannot be reduced to biology, but in this case, to computation. But it's the same thing. It's once again a nod to this idea of a soul against a world that is purely dead and mechanical. And I was very surprised of how explicit they were with this, because it's very against the culture. Usually what you try to do is putting those religious ideas without being too explicit, so that it grabs people's attention and it's meaningful, but people don't recognize it as religious, because otherwise their intellect starts to interfere and then it ruins the experience. But Roz claims that they cut her power and that she was gone. But she still heard him because she listened with a different part of herself. But what part is that? It's not like they erased the wrong part of her computer. It's that it's beyond the computer. It's also wonderful that it kind of fulfilled a prophecy earlier in the movie. When the fox was telling a bedtime story and the fictional account of how Roz became a mother, an important part is when she fell from the stars and she lost her memory. But what she didn't forget was her son. So anyway, this was just a small snippet of what can be said about the movie, and I'm obviously approaching it from a very specific angle, which I think is the most helpful, but it's not the only angle. So the movie is super deep. I only covered about half the notes that I had made for this video, and that isn't even exclusive in the first place. It's just what I noticed after my first rewatch, but I just tried to give you some of the main themes for you to think about. And also, even in the things that I did cover, there's a lot more to unpack, and I feel like in some of the things that I said, they could have been explained a lot better. But these things are very complicated, so I just did my best, and I hope it was helpful.